You have to think of the incredible math that's involved in these march columns, and it's hard to get your mind around. But these units are so large and these roads so narrow that when the head of the column starts walking, they've gone like 29 miles before the end of the column can start walking. Trying to plan to have food ready for these guys when they stop marching, and I mean, the logistics of this is incredible. And it's the main reason why you couldn't do this, ages and ages ago. You just couldn't support it. In addition, all these armies are fabulously trained. The Germans are incredibly trained in terms of having even their reservists on the practice fields in Germany doing live fire exercises preparing for this day. This is what Barbara Tuchman writes about. It starts with mobilization, and you get an idea of how planned every step is in the German army. Quote, "Once the mobilization button was pushed, the whole vast machinery for calling up, equipping, and transporting 2 million men began turning automatically. Reservists went to their designated depots, were issued uniforms, equipment, and arms, formed into companies, and companies into battalions, were joined by cavalry, cyclists, artillery, medical units, cook wagons, blacksmith wagons, even postal wagons, moved according to prepared railway timetables to concentration points near the frontier, where they would be formed into divisions, divisions into corps, and corps into armies, ready to advance and fight. One army corps alone," she writes, "out of the total of 40 in the German forces, required 170 railway cars for officers, 965 for infantry, 2,960 for cavalry, 1,915 for artillery and supply wagons, 6,010 in all, grouped in 140 trains, and an equal number again for their supplies. From the moment the order was given," she writes, "everything was to move at fixed times according to a schedule precise down to the number of train axles that would pass over a given bridge within a given time." End quote. When you realize how minutely planned and how, punctual this whole thing must be in order to function, you can see why delays of even a few hours will throw your whole timetable off. Right before this whole conflict breaks out, and I mentioned it earlier, the Kaiser will turn to von Moltke, and he's panicking at the last minute. The great supreme war leader's not so tough when it all looks like it's coming down. Unfortunately for him, or fortunately for him, the staff that works under him are tough as nails. Again, another thing this German army of this period brought to the table, which, to be honest, the second one did most of the time too, is fantastic leadership. And the Kaiser at one point thinks the war with Britain's off, and he says, "Great, we can turn the armies around, just send them to Russia instead of worrying about France and England at all." And von Moltke has to stop him and say, "You do not improvise the deployment of millions." I think the exact line was, "The deployment of millions cannot be improvised," but you get the point. This was an efficient plan to deploy the largest number of people that had ever been sent in a single area for a single purpose, probably in all human history. You think about Napoleon's greatest outrageous gamble, right, to invade Russia, utilizing an army composed of many, many, many different European peoples. He had to scrape Germany and every place else to get enough people to send into Russia with something that was called the Grand Army, in the early 1800s. And as this crazy endeavor sent maybe 750,000 men into Russia. The Germans were going to invade Belgium with more than twice that in an outflanking maneuver. That's not even the army that's holding the front. That's just a big, wide, swinging gate that's going to smash on top of the head of France. How do you control that many people? How do you even get them from one place to another? We kind of seem to think in our head that they can just march across, mountainsides and country lanes and through fields and pastures, and sometimes they do. But most of the time, they get to places the same way most of us do. They utilize the road system. Think about what the road system in Belgium, tiny little, mostly rural Belgium, is going to be like with this massive, greatest sized army probably ever put together, trying to march through it all in a short period of time. There were witnesses, of course, to this actually happening. One of the fun ones to read for me is Richard Harding Davis, because Davis is one of those guys, he's an American. He also, he's basically the war correspondent, one of the main ones of his era, and he wrote about the deployment of American forces in Cuba, at the turn of the century and all this kind of stuff. And he's really a rah Americana kind of guy, Americans the best at everything, and that sort of feeling. But he was there in Belgium as the German army comes through. And I'm going to read you this extensively because you can hear in his writing, his jaw is on the floor. And here's someone who doesn't think anybody does anything better than America. And he's getting a lesson in what the best army in the world looks like. And remember, this kind of force, at this kind of level and potency, hasn't been on display in anyone's living memory. You're getting a view of a nation at war like you would in Napoleonic times, but marched and equipped and organized and supported by a modern 20th century state. This was, you were beginning to see a tiny little glimmer of what the leap in the dark was going to entail. It was going to entail fighting armies like this one. Richard Harding Davis writes, quote, "The entrance of the German army into Brussels has lost the human quality. It was lost as soon as the three soldiers who led the army bicycled into the Boulevard du Regent and asked the way to the Gare du Nord. When they passed, the human note passed with them. What came after them, and 24 hours later is still coming, is not men marching, but a force of nature, like a tidal wave, an avalanche, or a river flooding its banks. At this minute, it is rolling through Brussels as the swollen waters of the Kamena Valley swept through Johnstown. At the sight of the first few regiments of the enemy," he writes, "we were thrilled with interest. After 3 hours they had passed in one unbroken steel-gray column, we were bored. But when hour after hour passed, and there was no halt, no breathing time, no open spaces in the ranks, the thing became uncanny, inhuman. You returned to watch it fascinated. It held the mystery and menace of fog rolling towards you across the sea." End quote. He then goes on to describe the uniforms, which are pretty much the same color the Second World War German uniforms are. Feldgrau, I guess is the proper way to pronounce it, but basically it's just a gray. But during this time period, most nations had only relatively recently gone away from gaudy, colorful clothing. Bright red scarlet for British troops has only recently given way to khaki. And the French army still wore stuff that looked like they belonged in Napoleon's army, right? They're going to wear red pants and blue jackets, and they're going to carry sabers, and their cavalry is going to have breastplates and horsehair helmets. It's kooky stuff. Most militaries are moving away from that. The Germans' use of gray, Harding thinks, is the most fantastic use of camouflage he's ever seen. The British khaki is often compared to a canary that's gotten dusty. Davis goes on and on about how the minute these German soldiers get 100 yards from you, you can't see them anymore. He says he was watching some German cavalry ride by, and he could see the horses, but he couldn't see the guys on them because they just sort of blend with the fog and the mist and the twilight and the early morning hours in that color. So he goes on and on about how great that is and how scientific it is. He goes on, quote, "Yesterday, Major General von Juratsky, the German military governor of Brussels, assured Burgomaster Max that the German army would not occupy the city, but would pass through it. It is still passing. I have followed in campaigns 6 armies, but excepting not even our own, the Japanese, or the British, I have not seen one so thoroughly equipped. I'm not speaking of the fighting qualities of any army, only of the equipment and organization. The German army moved into this city as smoothly and as compactly as the Empire State Express. There were no halts, no open places, no stragglers. This army," he writes, "has been on active service for 3 weeks. And so far there is not apparently a chin strap or a horseshoe missing. It came in with the smoke pouring from cook stoves on wheels, and in an hour had set up post office wagons from which mounted messengers galloped along the line of columns distributing letters, and at which soldiers posted picture postcards. The infantry," he writes, "came in files of 5, 200 men to each company. The lancers in columns of 4, with not a pennant missing. The quick-firing guns and field pieces were 1 hour at a time in passing, each gun with its ammunition wagon taking 20 seconds in which to pass. The men of the infantry sang 'Fatherland, my fatherland.' Between each line of song, they took 3 steps. At times, 2,000 men were singing together in absolute rhythm and beat. When the melody gave way, the silence was broken only by the stamp of iron-shod boots, and then again the song rose. When the singing ceased, the bands played marches. They were followed by the rumble of siege guns, the creaking of wheels, and of chains clanking against the cobblestones, and the sharp bell-like voices of the bugles. For 7 hours the army passed in such solid columns that not once might a taxicab or trolley car pass through the city. Like a river of steel it flowed, gray and ghost-like. Then, as dusk came and as thousands of horses' hooves and thousands of iron boots continued to tramp forward, they struck tiny sparks from the cobblestones. But the horses and men who beat out the sparks were invisible. At midnight, pack wagons and siege guns were still passing. At 7 this morning, I was awakened by the tramp of men and bands playing jauntily. Whether they marched all night or not, I do not know. But now, for 26 hours, the Grey Army has rumbled by, with the mystery of fog and the pertinacity of a steamroller. End quote. That was one quote. That's the German army, the Kaiserreich campaign. The German army in the Second World War is that country's best attempt to recreate that. Now, I've always believed that the very ferocity and the scariness of this Kaiserreich German army worked against it at the beginning of the war in a way that hurt it throughout the entire, history of the war, and I think long afterwards, helped establish this German reputation as sort of the bad guys. Because this army was so intimidating, so scary, everything from the precision drill to the equipment, to how well organized they were, to the logistics, to the leadership, to the intimidating elements built into it. I mean, they had a wonderful unit called the Death's Head Hussars, which goes back to, the Napoleonic Wars earlier, actually. And they wear the old-fashioned hussar's fur helmet. This is in 1914, folks. This isn't in, 1810. The fur helmet of the hussars, and on the fur helmet is a skull. Reminds you a little bit of the SS forces in the Second World War, but it shows you that all of this predated, what the Nazis did. The Nazis were just updating a lot of classic German traditions, and in a lot of cases perverting them and staining them with blackness and everything. But the Death's Head Hussars are famous and intimidating, as they're meant to be. But then you take that really nasty, ferocious, intimidating army that looks like it could take on anyone in the world, and the first time you see them in action, they're taking on, God bless them, the Belgians. A tiny little neutral nation that's less than 100 years old and has never fought a war. In fact, is so small and is surrounded by great powers that they rationally figured out a long time ago it doesn't matter how much effort they put into defense, they can't win. The Belgians, totally unprepared for warfare, lose only a little bit faster than the Belgians obsessively prepared for warfare. They put their trust in these international agreements they had with people who were going to guarantee their security, which is how this whole thing's happening anyway, right? But they did build some defenses, maybe as a sign that, we can't kill you, but we could hurt you. And the defenses are really cool, because it's really right in that period in human history where fortifications, forts, reach sort of their high water mark. I mean, we still build forts today, but it's nothing like it was, pretty much from the beginning of, human history until about the time we're talking about here, because then you could base an entire defense strategy on forts. Nowadays, we have these special positions where you'll guard them with a fort, but if anybody decides they're going to start launching missiles and bombs, and it doesn't matter. Forts don't hold up. That's something we learn very soon in this story. But in the 1880s, when these Belgian forts are built, this is the period where it looks like modern tech is going to make these things like space age, like something out of Star Wars, one of those planetary defenses. And they build these wonderful subterranean forts, Barbara Tuchman said, like castles sunk underground. And what they'll do is, I'm reminded of the old Godzilla films and the Monster Zero films where you'd have some planet and it would have a gun that would just rise up from the planet's surface, shoot, and then go back down underground. And that's what happened in these forts. And I have to remind myself how cool that is. This is like steampunk stuff, because when they're building these forts for Belgium, it's the same time that the United States and Mexico are trying to corral Geronimo and a bunch of Apaches in the American Southwest. While that's going on, the Belgians are building underground forts. And you can see some of this stuff on video if you look at the Maginot Line, which comes a generation after this, obviously. But it's the same kind of thing where, if you look at it from above ground, you can barely tell there's a fort there. when in fact underground, massive concrete and, little railroads underneath moving guns and ammunition around. It's cool stuff. And the way the Belgian designer, who was one of the best in the world, built this system, he took advantage of the natural river and the slight rise in the hill and everything in there, and he built 6 big forts with 6 small forts in between, and they all cover each other's fields of fire with their guns. So, what Fort A can reach with their guns, Fort B can reach with theirs too, so they overlap. So there's never a place, in the distance anyway, where the guns can't reach the enemy. And in between these forts, the Belgians have it so that they're going to put guys in trenches. So between every fort are people, they're supported by the guns. It's this wonderful system, and then you throw more troops out, 500 yards, 1,000 yards ahead to keep enemy artillery away, and you have this system where maybe you can't win a war against someone like the Germans, but you can give them a bloody nose and maybe say, see, you really don't want to do this. The Germans aren't sure about that, and when they come into Belgium, they're kind of thinking the Belgian army's either just going to stand aside, like I said earlier, or maybe, a few shots up in the air, we protected our honor, now we're going to stand aside. And the first sign that the Germans are wrong about this is that the bridges are blown up when they get to them. The tunnels are blown up. The railroads are blown up. That maddens the Germans because they're on this tight schedule, right? So now they have to deal with at least transportation nightmares on this road system that was already going to be clogged terribly. I mean, there's your first nightmare. And then the Germans try to cross some of these rivers on the frontier in pontoons, and the Belgians start shooting at them. So the Germans put into action a group that they have designed specifically to take these forts. And this is the part of the story you have to understand where we are. When war is declared, you have like 72 hours where everybody's trying to get their heads around this idea. And at the same time, they flipped all these switches for mobilization, the doomsday device, I called it, where they're calling up all these forces and everybody, we don't have enough stuff here, and everybody's scrambling in what they assume is a race to the front lines, which they don't want to lose. Remember, what if they gave a war and only one side came? Meanwhile, though, while everybody is concentrating, it's called, their forces, the Germans have like 30,000 guys that were set up in advance to go out basically in the pregame of the First World War, I guess you could say, and take out these forts if they have to, because these forts are blocking the roads. You cannot get to that Belgian road system that you need to get from Germany to France if you don't take the forts around a place like Liège or Namur. And so 30,000 men have been training for years for just this job. Like I said earlier, the day was called Der Tag, the day. This has been planned for a long time, and the Germans have essentially a special unit of 30,000 guys whose job it is to take out these forts if the Belgians don't stand aside and surrender them. The Belgians don't stand aside and surrender them. And in fact, the Belgians are going to teach the first great lesson of the war about what's changed since the last time great powers faced off. How much the killing power that machines afforded mankind on the battlefield, how much that had changed the age-old equation of war. Machines had been taken over for a long time, becoming more and more important. This is the war where they take over completely. And man's supremacy on the battlefield, even though they're the ones who run the machines, will always be now, secondary compared to the killing power and mechanization that can be brought to bear, by modern societies. The technology was devastating when used against tribal peoples and nations that couldn't compete militarily. The Belgians are going to show what a tiny little army of chocolate soldiers is what the Germans thought they were going to face. What a tiny little army of chocolate soldiers can do to the greatest army in the world because of the deadliness of the weapons at hand. And one of the interesting sort of sub-themes of this whole upcoming conflict is how long it takes some people to absorb the lessons that are being taught in this conflict. Lesson number one is how deadly the weapons are and how you have to account for that. Some of the generals and military thinkers understood this going into the war because they had paid close attention to that 1905 war I told you about, the Russo-Japanese War, which, by the way, American President Teddy Roosevelt won a Nobel Prize for helping to broker the peace for that. But that taught lessons about what happens when two sides armed with machine guns and two sides armed with modern artillery and all that face off. But the lessons were not the kind of lessons some people wanted to learn. I mean, if you were a cavalryman, for example, your arm of the military is already not looked upon as very survivable. The wars all since Napoleon have kind of shown that, listen, cavalry just dies on the battlefield. The only thing that cavalry commanders still have going in their favor is there aren't really automobiles yet. There will be by the time this war is over. But they're a novelty. They'll be used in strange, innovative situations. But militaries of the world don't have tons of automobiles, running. It's not mechanized like the Second World War. Everybody's using horses. Even if they die on the battlefield, like sheaves of wheat being scythed down, you have nothing to replace that mobility with. But these cavalry commanders don't want to hear that it's even worse than it used to be. Wow, wait till the modern artillery machine guns get a hold of your cavalry. They don't want to hear that, so they talk about the results as being unrepresentative. Commanders who are very, involved in the idea of the power of the bayonet and the charge and the offensive. For example, the entire French outlook on war right now is connected to this idea that you attack. And, you attack with the bayonet. Doesn't really mean you're going to maybe get into hand-to-hand combat, but that aggressive style of warfare is what you want. If you've been preaching that, and that's your country's doctrine, and your entire military is organized around the culture of the offensive, and crâne, which is the French word, I guess, for, guts, and, it's all about guts. Nobody wants to hear that machine guns just rip guts out. That's the only thing they care about, guts, and it doesn't work to have bayonet charges and ridiculous offensives. Well, the French would say, yes, well, what doesn't work for the Russians or the Japanese will work for the French, and that's why we have a great military. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to rationalize what you don't want to learn. Many of the militaries of the world are organized like Napoleonic times. They don't want to hear that is a completely wrong way to be organized. The French cavalry heading off to war, as I said earlier, but you have to imagine this. If you want to see what Napoleon's soldiers looked like, go look at pictures of the French cavalry in 1914 going off to war with metal breastplates and horsehair helmets, and you would have to be an expert to look at a picture of them in 1914 and a picture of Napoleon's cavalry in 1814 and find the differences. The officers are going to go to war in white gloves. They're going to have swords. They're going to stand up, and troops are going to march into combat in billiard ball formations or bowling pin formations, drill formations from the battlefield. None of the people who consider this to be an integral part of military culture want to learn that the rules have changed. In 1905, they got one lesson. In 1914, they were about to get another. And the Germans get theirs when they try to take these forts. On August 5th, 1914, the Germans attack 4 of these Belgian forts. Now, between the forts, the Belgians have quickly put some infantry, and there are a couple machine guns around and whatnot, and the Germans, they're in a bit of a rush here. They don't have time to sit there and starve things out. This 30,000-man force with artillery has to go in there and power this through so that the armies behind them can continue their huge assault through Belgium on France, and they charge these entrenchments, and the Belgians slaughter them. Mounds of bodies, and the Belgians can't figure out the best way to deal with it because the mounds of bodies become a problem. Because the mounds of bodies become places German troops can hide behind and shoot from behind and launch attacks from behind. And the Belgians are trying to figure out, okay, do we shoot through these bodies and can you create a hole through bodies if you shoot through them with a machine gun long enough? Or do we send out people to risk their lives to create holes in the bodies that we can shoot through? Barbara Tuchman has a passage in her book where she quotes the commander of the Belgian forces that were resisting this German assault by General von Emich and his special brigades. Tuchman writes, quote, "On August 5th, Emich's brigades opened the attack on the 4 easternmost forts of Liège with a cannonade by field artillery, followed by an infantry assault. The light shells made no impression, and the Belgian guns poured a hail of fire on the German troops, slaughtering their front ranks. Company after company came on, making for the spaces in between the forts where the Belgian entrenchments had not been completed. At some points where they broke through, the Germans stormed up the slopes where the guns could not be depressed to reach them, and were mowed down by the fort's machine guns. The dead piled up in ridges a yard high. At Fort Vauchon, Belgians, seeing the German lines waver, charged with the bayonet and threw them back. Again and again the Germans returned to the assault, spending lives like bullets in the knowledge of plentiful reserves to make up for the losses." She now quotes a Belgian officer who was there. quote. They made no attempt at deploying, a Belgian officer described it later, but came on line after line, almost shoulder to shoulder, until we shot them down. The fallen were heaped on top of each other in an awful barricade of dead and wounded that threatened to mask our guns and cause us trouble. So high did the barricade become that we didn't know whether to fire through it or to go out and clear openings with our hands. But would you believe it? This veritable wall of dead and dying enabled those wonderful Germans to creep closer and actually charge up the embankment. They got no farther than halfway, though, because our machine guns and rifles swept them back. Of course, we had our losses, but they were slight compared to the carnage we inflicted on our enemies. End quote. It's interesting to note, isn't it, that Belgian officer's respect for those wonderful Germans, as he called them, exhibiting the military virtues of valor that were so celebrated during this period, where the romance of warfare, which had always been strong in human culture, was probably at its height. The 19th century, the romance was incredible. This is the era where that romance runs into reality in a way that you just can't pretend. I mean, guys like, William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general for the U.S., famously said that war is hell and its glory is all moonshine. But that didn't really seep into the mass of the population. As one historian had pointed out, they weren't publishing a whole lot of combat photos and really nasty, terrible stuff for the folks back home at any time during these periods. So there wasn't a lot of stuff to really counteract the romantic ideas of war. This is the conflict where you can't hide it anymore. And even though this Belgian officer looks at this German assault on his fort as something akin to the charge of the Light Brigade, the famous doomed charge of that British cavalry during the Crimean War. But here's the thing that this war is going to teach. If you watch the charge of the Light Brigade and you think it's magnificent and brave, a doomed sort of attack on the part of incredibly, courageous men, what happens if after the charge fails, they send another one and the same results occur? And then they send another one and the same results occur. And then they do it again and again. At what point does this wonderful, doomed, romantic, celebration of the courage of the military heart become something obscene? This war is going to take us there, and it's going to pound the point home till you're sick of it. After the failure of that German attack on the Belgian defenses, the Germans regrouped to attack again that same night, August 5th. They're waiting for the sun to go down, and witnesses who were with the troops described them as nervous and anxious and gloomy about the prospects of assaulting, these defenses again. What's more, doing it at night. Throughout most of human history, night assaults, if you were lucky, had torchlight illumination. It was always a huge gamble, very disorienting. You couldn't see anything. That was going to change with this war, and it was going to be a facet of 20th century warfare that we may never see repeated again. Now that night vision has become a battlefield staple, there's no reason to light up the battlefield. In fact, if one side has night vision and the other doesn't, you don't want it lit up. In this period, these Germans were going to go into conflict where the nighttime darkness could be banished by technology. You had searchlights in these forts, and you had searchlights on the German side sometimes. You had shells that you could shoot up into the air that would illuminate the night sky, and you have to imagine bunches of those shells going off, at separate intervals where they overlap, and so they're getting brighter and darker, and the look of it reminds you of like a flash bulb flash, that sort of strobe light, fluorescent illumination, and it just casts a ghostly pall over the whole battlefield, so that every time you get that burst of light, you see thousands of people like ants moving along the battlefield, and then you have artillery going off. And just think about how weird and disorienting being in the middle of a modern battlefield would be in the daytime, and now take away the light. It's freaky. And that's what these German soldiers are about to face, and they're understandably nervous. They expected some sort of romantic kind of war. Even if it was dangerous, you had a chance for heroism and a chance to die for your country. This is a generation that is absolutely infused with the ideas of nationalism, and that dying for your country is a huge, glorious thing that you should look forward to. And now they're seeing, wait a minute, how glorious is it to be one of many people mowed down by machine guns, just sort of randomly. They don't want to go on the assault again, and this attack starts to bog down after it starts. Now, there's an officer who's roaming around the battlefield, who normally is in Berlin with the high general staff of the German military. The Germans encourage their staff members to get out in the field sometimes and see what's going on, and this guy had a particular interest in this battle because he was one of the people who planned it. For years he'd been planning this battle. He took his vacations from Germany to Belgium just to look around where the battle was going to be fought, and now, since he had a vested interest in hoping his plans were carried out correctly, he's wandering around this battlefield at night looking for what the holdup is, and finds out that a general commanding a certain part of the attack is dead, killed by machine gun fire. So this guy, this staff officer, who historians have described as absolutely devoid of fear, big man, grabs the unit of the dead general, 5,000 or 6,000 men, in the dark, and starts leading them toward the objective. You know, you got all these forts, more than 400 guns from the forts, and then the guns on the German side. It's just got to be this unbelievable, chaotic mess in the dark, and this one general has grabbed this unit and is heading toward the city of Liège, which is protected by this circle of forts, right, with men in between all the forts. He finds a spot that's undefended, leads this unit past the forts into the city on this gamble that maybe the city won't be defended, or maybe if I walk in there with 6,000 guys, they'll just lay down their weapons. Now, the Germans don't have a lot to celebrate in their military history in the Second World War because the cause was so nasty. It doesn't matter, you know, how many good things their troops did in terms of military history, the military side of things. The cause is so corrupt it taints everything. The Germans can take some justifiable pride in the adventure story of this guy, because first he walks in the city and everybody just sort of surrenders to him there, and then he goes up to the citadel, the main defense in the center of the city. With his sword hilt, he pounds on the door demanding the surrender, and they open up the door and they surrender. Yikes. Talk about boldness. Talk about gambling. This is a basically unknown German officer who, because of the name he is making for himself, will be in a position that some historians will call the military dictator of Germany within 4 years. His name is Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff's actions that night remind us once again that even though, as I've said several times, the machines have kind of taken over the dominant role in warfighting, artillery, guns, all those things are machines, you can't discount the human factor. In fact, the human factor is probably the dominant factor amongst adversaries that are somewhat evenly matched. I mean, no amount of military genius is going to save Belgium from Germany. The differences between the potential of the two sides is just too great. But between relatively equal or only moderately unequal powers, leadership could be the determining factor. And the boldness shown by Ludendorff that night is a precursor to what we can expect from him later on, and what the Russians can expect from him very, very soon. Now, Ludendorff's very audacious capture of the city of Liège doesn't solve the problem that the Germans have, because all those forts are still active. He's taken the city, he hasn't taken the forts, and they're still there, ready to shoot up German march columns if they're not taken before the big march starts. So Ludendorff calls for his, ace in the hole. As I said, the Germans have been planning for this attack for a very long time. They knew that the Belgians might resist, and they knew if they did, they had to have a weapon that was greater than anything the people who built these forts ever envisioned. In the 1880s, although some of these forts date to the 1890s, in that era, the forts were basically guaranteed to the Belgian government to be invulnerable to any cannon then known in the world. But the cannons that were then known in the world are no longer the maximum size cannons available in the world. Those belonged to the Germans, and no one even knew it until they first showed up on the scene. And they become an even better demonstration than the machine gun fire mowing down those poor Germans charging the Belgian defenses, that the weaponry was simply doomsday device-like, if you imagine it magnified thousands of times. The weapons that are on the way from Germany to Belgium to reduce these forts are the best example I can think of to show how much has changed since the last time the great powers fought each other in Europe 100 years before. And nowhere is that more on display in the artillery. which 100 years ago, during Napoleon's time, was already what Napoleon thought decided battles. And he was a guy who made his bones in the artillery. He rose through the ranks as an artillery officer. He's known for its use on the battlefield. Here's a guy that could shock people with the killing power of well-used artillery, and his big guns were firing 12-pound cannonballs. 12-pound cannonballs. The gun itself weighed about 1,200 pounds. It's the same gun, essentially, in one case, that both sides in the U.S. Civil War used, about a 1,200-pound cannon. The largest of the guns that are on the way from Berlin to Belgium, the largest of them weighs 300,000 pounds. 1,200 pounds to 300,000 pounds. That's quite a change. The shells that Napoleon's 12-pounders fired were between 9 and 12 pounds. The shell that the largest of these guns, a 420-millimeter mortar, fires, that shell weighs 2,000 pounds. The Napoleonic cannon that was so deadly at the time that it was shocking had an effective range of about 2,000 yards. The largest of these guns on the way from Berlin, which aren't even designed, some of them, for range at all, the largest of these is a siege cannon, so it doesn't even have to fire very far. It has 7 times the range of that French cannon that was designed in its day to shoot far. This is an entirely new kind of warfare. And the people who actually see this gun after it's assembled are slack-jawed. And assembled it must be. Because think about how hard it would be trying to transport any of these large guns, especially the largest of them, now. Now turn the clock back to 1914 style technology, where automobiles aren't even very old. They're a relatively new product. Tractors are even newer. Railways don't go everywhere you need them to, and these guns weigh a ton. Guns that are this large usually can only be put on ships. That's how you get them from place to place. These are essentially naval guns in size. We're talking about a gun that is just over a 16-inch gun. That's traditionally a naval gun. Later on, you'll have rail guns that are that large too. Same problem, though. How do you get them from place to place? They're so big, they're so heavy. The largest battleship guns, ever deployed were the Yamato Japanese super battleships, and theirs were 18.1 inches. The famous American battleships, the last effective ones we built, the Iowa class, the Missouris, they had 16-inch guns. Imagine those guns trying to be transported, across land, getting them to where you need them to go. The guns on the way to reduce these forts are that kind of size. The largest of them, 16-inch guns. It takes forever and is an amazing engineering feat just to get these guns to where they need to be. And then when they get there, the crew for these largest guns, and it's like a couple hundred guys, have to lay cement. The cement has to dry. The gun has to be assembled and put together. Then when they want to fire this thing, this gives you an idea of the monsters we're talking about, the gun crew had to go 3 football fields away, 300 yards away, and fire the thing electronically. And they were still so close that they had to put cotton wadding over their eyes, their nose, and their ears, and they had to fire this thing while their mouth was open, or they'd blow out their eardrums, and potentially worse than that. Imagine what this weapon does. The shell is fired in a 4,000-foot arc. It takes a full minute to get from the gun to the target, so you fire it, and then there's the 60-second wait until the explosion happens. Unlike Napoleon's time, we have cool shells that can be delayed action fused and armored piercing, so that when you fire them at these forts, they hit the top of the fort. That's the kind of arc they have. They don't fire flat at something. They fire way up in the air, and then it drops right on top of these forts. A shell that pierces armor or concrete, and then once it reaches its maximum depth, then it explodes. The wonderful world of science and engineering is going to take over the battlefields of this upcoming conflict in a way that has never happened before. And this weapon, to me, most symbolizes, in this early part of the war, your example of, here's your wake-up call. Here's your Darth Vader. Here's what 20th century warfare is going to mean. the gun arrives, along with some cousins who are slightly smaller from the also great armaments works of Skoda in Austro-Hungarian territory then. And the weapons created by Krupp and Skoda start shelling these forts, and they start going down, and they start going down fast. Now, those of you who've listened to many of my shows know I'm not a huge John Keegan fan, but as a historian, I think he's best on his World War I and World War II histories, and he wrote about this gun's arrival outside the forts and said, quote, "After it was emplaced, the bombardment began. The crew, wearing head padding, lay prone 300 yards away while the gun was fired electronically." Quoting somebody at the scene now. Quote, "60 seconds ticked by, the time needed for the shell to traverse its 4,000-meter trajectory, and everyone listened in to the telephone report of our battery commander, who had his observation post 1,500 meters from the bombardment fort, and could watch at close range the column of smoke, earth, and fire that climbed into the heavens." Keegan continues, quote, "The first of the shells, delay fused to explode only after penetration of the fort's protective skin, fell short. 6 minutes later, the next was fired. Then 5 more, each of them walked up towards the target as the elevation was corrected. The relentless approaching footfall of the detonations spoke to the paralyzed defenders of the devastation to come. The 8th struck home. Then the gun fell silent for the night. But the next morning, joined by the other, which had completed the journey from Essen, the bombardment reopened. The range had been found, and soon the 2,000-pound shells were, quote, stripping away armor plate and blocks of concrete, cracking arches, and poisoning the air with heavy brown fumes," end quote. And Keegan then goes on to say, I'm not going to murder the poor French names of these forts, but at 12:30, one fort is a wreck, he says, and is physically incapacitated and surrenders. They then shift fire to another fort, which surrenders 5 hours later. A third explodes when its magazine is hit by one of these shells, completely destroying the whole thing. That will happen to a couple of these forts, by the way. And when they find those, the Germans who are first on the scene say that they look like, quote, a miniature alpine landscape with debris strewn about like pebbles in a mountain stream. Heavy artillery and ammunition had been thrown everywhere. A cupola had been blown from its place and had fallen on its dome, and it now looked like a monstrous tortoise lying on its shell. As these forts began to fall, the artillery then closed in on the fort that had the general commanding this whole affair. And he himself wrote what it was like to be under fire by weapons that no one had ever seen the like of in human history. Quote, "A shell wrecked the arcade under which the general staff were sheltering. All light was extinguished by the force of the explosion, and the officers ran the risk of asphyxiation by the horrible gases emitted from the shell. When the firing ceased, I ventured out on a tour of inspection on the external slopes, which I found had been reduced to a rubble heap. A few minutes later," he writes, "the bombardment was resumed. It seemed as though all the German batteries were firing salvos. Nobody will ever be able to form an adequate idea of what the reality was like. I have only learned since that when the big siege mortars entered into the action, they hurled against us shells weighing 1,000 kilos, the explosive force of which surpassed anything known hitherto. Their approach was to be heard in an acute buzzing, and then they burst with a thunderous roar, raising clouds of missiles, stones, and dust. After some time passed amid these horrors, I wished to return to my observation tower, but I'd hardly advanced a few feet into the gallery when a great blast passed by and I was thrown violently to the ground. I managed to get up and continued on my way, only to be stopped by a choking cloud of poisonous gas. It was a mixture of the gas from an explosion and the smoke of a fire in the troops' quarters. We were driven back, half suffocated. Looking out of a peephole, I saw to my horror that the fort had fallen, slopes and counterslopes being a chaos of rubbish, while huge tongues of flame were shooting forth from the throat of the fortress. My first and last thought, he writes, was to try to save the remnant of the garrison. I rushed out to give orders and saw some soldiers whom I mistook for Belgian gendarmes. I called them and then fell again. Poisonous gases seemed to grip my throat as in a vice." End quote. He woke up to one of his aides and the German officer giving him water. Those soldiers he thought were Belgian were German. They were the first to enter the fort after a shell detonated through the magazine and the entire fort went up in a giant explosion. These are enormous metal and steel and concrete forts. These guns were pulverizing forts that were built to withstand the guns of just a generation before, and doing so with ease. That's a demonstration of how much things had changed just since the 1880s, and think of how much things had changed from Napoleon's time to the 1880s. This was a 19th century world discovering the horrors of 20th century warfare, and they were going to have to learn how to deal with this new reality, one horrific, bloody lesson at a time. The lesson of Liège is that the eras of basing your defenses on forts is over. This is a lesson that will not be learned and will be taught again in France in May 1940. It's also my opinion that the Germans are being taught a lesson even as this story's going down and the guns are pulverizing the forts in Belgium. The Germans should be picking up on what, current events are trying to teach them. They will never take that lesson to heart, and they will repeat these mistakes they're making in Belgium again in the Second World War. It's safe to say, I think, that the damage done to the German reputation globally because of what's going on in Belgium won't go away till at least the 1950s, and I think you could make a very decent case. It never gone away. And it involves German treatment of neutral countries and non-combatants wherever they find them. And, as you watch this story unfold, it's clear that in some respects the Germans just don't get it. I mean, you would think they would. This is a country that, it's funny now, they've lost this reputation due to 2 world wars and their involvement in both of them. But they used to be considered an absolute hotbed of human culture. The cutting edge of art and science and literature and thought, philosophy. All these things that the Germans really prided themselves in. Music. An incredible people that guys like H.G. Wells were intimidated by. Couldn't help admire them, but was intimidated by how ahead of things they seem to be, how advanced they seem to be in all these areas. How strangely ironic, though, that people that are so advanced in those areas could have so many blind spots in areas that one would think are related to the higher culture aspects. Do the people who are producing such cutting-edge higher culture, how do they miss something that's likely to be as damaging to your international reputation as what history now calls the Rape of Belgium? Now, the Rape of Belgium, I should point out a little bit, is a propagandist's fantasy. They've made it into practically a movie, The Rape of Belgium. Go see The Rape of Nanking in your history books, and then you will see something that propagandists did not need to magnify at all to create a world-class historical atrocity killing field. Belgium wasn't that, but it was something. And that something would come back to haunt the Germans in ways that they almost seem ignorant of. Again, we quoted Hitler earlier about propaganda. Hitler sees it after the war, that the Germans were just blindsided by 20th century global communications and the ability to manipulate world opinion by taking things that were real, facts, and blowing them up to levels that just incensed whole societies, including neutral countries. The Germans don't understand that the way they're conducting themselves in Belgium is affecting public opinion in places like the United States, which have large German-American populations, by the way, which are cheering, the feats of arms and how the German military is showing themselves to be so dominant. American papers are not 100% against the Germans at this point. In some places, American papers are in regions that are dominated by German Americans. But they can't explain away what's happening in Belgium and what starts the day the invasion of Belgium happens. The Germans start killing Belgian citizens. And they do so as part of what is now understood to be a policy of frightfulness, as it was called. I'm not sure that's the perfect translation of the term, but the Germans intended to, set examples of people that did things that the Germans had said you shouldn't do. They said you shouldn't blow up bridges. If they find you blowing up bridges, they are going to punish you, and they do not give probation. They will hang you. They will shoot you if they catch you trying to blow up a bridge. The Germans take that even farther, though. If you're near a village where a bridge gets blown up, the village might pay the price. The Germans believed in collective punishment. They also believed in taking hostages for good behavior. And when people did stuff anyway, they killed the hostages. This has been one of the most contentious parts of, new scholarship all the time on the question of atrocities in Belgium. Because, during the war, it is this huge deal. And those of you, by the way, who've lived long enough have seen this same dynamic at work where real atrocities happen. I remember in the first Gulf War, the stories of, Iraqi soldiers taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and throwing them on the floor and then stealing the incubators. And all these stories are normal because real atrocities are going on, but then they're magnified because the magnification works to the benefit of the enemies of the people the propaganda is working against. The Germans went in and did a bunch of things in Belgium that make them look bad because they were bad, and then the foreign media like the British were fantastic at this, get a hold of those stories and turn them into the worst things you could ever think of. The Germans only began to get this, a few people at a time. I mean, later on, much later on, the Kaiser's son, a guy known as the Crown Prince, would say that Belgium is when the Germans lost the first great battle of the war. But they didn't lose it on the battlefield. They crushed the Belgians. They lost it in the realm of global public opinion because of their behavior. Behavior that the Germans will use all throughout this war and again in the Second World War. This tendency to ignore neutrality. As we said earlier, the German diplomat, told the British diplomat this: you're going to go to war over a piece of paper? It's just a piece of neutrality is often violated in war. That's kind of how they thought. They also thought you treat non-combatants harshly. And, to sort of soften that a little, it's worth noting that the Germans treat their own people this way. They are a stern, rather strict, some would say severe society, especially, the Prussianized elements of it. And they expect, obedience and discipline and conformity to the rules, and that's what they expect of their own people. And then they go into Belgium, and when people violate the rules, they get treated harshly. Germans just failed to foresee, maybe with cultural blinders, that people that come from much less severe traditions would maybe, play that quality up as something uniquely German and nasty. Not just that, it should be pointed out that a lot of different peoples, in the world at this time were having problems dealing with irregular fighting. This was a big deal at the time. Irregular fighting, of course, is when, regular people take up arms and start shooting at your soldiers, like guerrilla troops, for example. In Vietnam, the U.S. fought Viet Cong guerrillas. Very difficult to do. Causes all kinds of problems. Atrocities tend to happen. The British had just dealt with this not altogether successfully in South Africa, where atrocity issues happened. The French were dealing with it in Asia and North Africa. The Russians were dealing with it in Central Asia. The Japanese were dealing with it in China and Korea. This is a problem a lot of countries were having. The Germans were very worried about what were called free shooters. Today we would call them snipers, because in the War of 1870, they had a lot of problems with snipers. So they went into Belgium, and if they thought snipers were there, people paid the price left, right, and center. I mean, whole towns would be executed if a sniper was loose. And here's the worst part. Snipers may not have even been loose. Some historians say these are a bunch of gun-shy soldiers who've never faced, live fire where someone was shooting at them. They may hear some German soldier's gun go off from the other side of town and start killing civilians. It's a very controversial